reject the patronizing idea that government in Washington, D.C. is inevitably more wise, more honest, and more efficient than government at the local or state level. The honesty and efficiency of government depends on people. Government at all levels has good people and bad people. The idea that a bureaucratic elite in Washington knows best what is best for people everywhere, and that you cannot trust local governments, is really a contention that you cannot trust people to govern themselves. Let us give the people of America a chance, a bigger voice in deciding for themselves those questions that so greatly affect their lives.
I started on the Hill in 1973. Senate District Committee. I was Minority Staff Director. And that year we passed the Home Rule Bill from the Senate side. Congress has jurisdiction over the District of Columbia. That's in the Constitution. But Congress can delegate powers. And they did delegate a certain number of powers to the district government.
In the 1970s, when the district got home rule, limited home rule, the district was coming out of over a century of being essentially an agency of the federal government. The federal government did everything, not just appropriated dollars, but oversight, established policy. But when we got the autonomy that we got with home rule, we had to go about the business of setting up governing ourselves.
What this change means is that once again in America, we are placing our trust in people.
Okay, we are rolling.
Okay. Would you mind telling us who you are and what your role is here?
I am Phil Mendelson. I am the chairman of the Council of the District of Columbia. The city in the mid-'70s got home rule and was struggling to get on its feet.
Well, the reputation in D.C. was not very good.
People in government were doing things that they ought not to have been doing. One of the overriding concerns that many of us had was that the city had the capacity to handle its own problems so that the Congress would not intervene. And it was a very painful episode that we went through. The city, at one point, was on the verge of bankruptcy.
We spent the mid-'70s when we got home rule struggling with how to set up an effective, efficient home rule government.
Congress wanted a watchdog in the city to ensure that the city wouldn't go bankrupt.
When the Office of Inspector General was created, it replaced what was called the Municipal Audit and Inspection Agency. So essentially, you go from having an agency that just does financial audits and some performance audits to an agency who's now responsible for overseeing the entirety of the district government.
The district is a big and complex government. It's 35,000 plus employees. It's a $15.5 billion budget. It's a city, it's a state, it's a county, and it's a school district.
As with any large organization or government, there needs to be an independent office with the responsibility of investigating allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse.
As mayor and as a taxpayer, I want to make sure that the dollars that the mayor and the council invest in a program or service are being used for those programs and services.
The audit team is the team that goes out and makes sure that programs, financial operations are in fact operating with integrity.
We pretty much examine programs
and determine if the agency is doing what they're supposed to be doing, like following their own policies, procedures, laws.
You need someone who can objectively tell you how your money's being spent, if it's being spent effectively and efficiently, and whether there are improvements that could be made to have the limited resources go the furthest and help the greatest amount of people.
Audit is never about got you. So we find something that is not, being done right. The management takes a proactive action once we inform them, and they start fixing it. At the end of the audit, we issue a report, but we also give credit that you have taken proactive action in solving it. And that way, it's a win-win situation for everybody.
It's difficult to walk into a huge agency and try to understand how it works and, where your weaknesses are. So if someone can come in and help you at least start to take a piece of that to help you get control, I mean, that's pretty reassuring.
We're not bad guys. We're just here to help you. And like I said, to help your agency run smoother.
That's what we want, a good government that functions with high integrity and high efficiencies and in the best way it can.
And unfortunately, when you have a big organization, over 30,000 people, a lot of moving parts, complex systems, things can go wrong by mistake. And sometimes things could go wrong because people mean to do harm to the government.
Investigations is responsible for any alleged misconduct, be it administrative or criminal, in any district program or operation. Something as simple as time and attendance abuses, all the way up to felony fraud cases.
Harriet Walters, yes. I mean, unbelievable what she was able to do.
The case originated through the FBI. They had someone contact them from a bank. They apparently had received a check for $300-some thousand. The teller at the bank contacted a friend of hers that was an FBI agent and said, "You need to look into this." Once they determined that the check was from the tax office in DC government, they contacted us. Because there were tax refunds going out, they couldn't explain as to, okay, what business is this? What is this tax refund for? And then when we contacted some of the names that were on these refunds, some of them had no clue that the refund was even issued. So now everyone's scrambling to determine, how did this happen?
Nothing the individual did was particularly sophisticated. In areas where you should have, tight internal controls, those internal controls were either non-existent or they were thwarted. What was so shocking was just the sheer magnitude of the fraud.
She got away with that much? And she was living large. People in the office knew it.
Do you remember some of the extravagances Harriet Walters was spending money on?
Well, designer clothes, designer handbags, designer shoes. She loved shopping at Neiman Marcus. The media had a field day with it.
Just the tonnage of conspicuous consumption items found in her house. Some of them had new tags on them. She hadn't even gotten around to using them. She was just someone who was extraordinarily greedy.
She would go to Atlantic City. She would go to Las Vegas for gambling. The casino, she would take people with her. She would actually invite people in and pay for their trip as well.
She's Lady Bountiful. A little here, a little there, a little here, a little there, all with other people's money. She was a bleeding heart. He was taking care of other people, for goodness sakes. You're gonna punish her for that? Don't give her the maximum, her lawyer argued. She had all that.
Harriet Walters is now serving a 17-and-a-half-year prison sentence. Her 9 accomplices are also incarcerated for helping raid the D.C. Treasury undetected for nearly 2 decades. Prosecutors say much of the cash has been spent, but a few $1 million was recovered from one bank account. That money and the forfeited property now belong to the D.C. government.
The city now was confronted with making sure they had an understanding of how internal control weaknesses and a lack of insight into employees' behaviors can lead to a multi-million-dollar fraud.
But there are consequences. What about victims? People are being taken advantage of, not just taxpayers, but people are going without services because somebody else is wrongfully taking those resources. How do you respond to that? How do you address that? Our Inspector General is on top of it, identifying it, calling people to account, changing personnel. To the extent that we do that, we're governing ourselves. That's why it's important to have an aggressive Inspector General.
We're elected officials. We weren't elected because we were trained investigators. However, the Inspector General has an office full of trained investigators. So there's more expertise, more skill at being able to look at what's going on, the inner workings of an agency.
The Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, or as we call it, the MFUCU, they have a very specific mandate to investigate fraud in the Medicaid program.
We have identified through our investigations a number of cases of healthcare fraud, which we've identified those subjects, whether it be a company or an individual.
The Makundi case was probably our largest fraud case here in the OIG.
They stole massive amounts of money.
22 people were arrested, 49 bank accounts with millions of dollars frozen, 6 luxury cars seized, and 1 house is being sought for foreclosure.
Florence Makundi was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a restitution of about a little over $80 million.
How has that translated into better services for district residents?
We've been able to reduce the amount of fraud within the District of Columbia and return some monies to the program, which allows for those programs to continue for our Medicaid beneficiaries or the people of DC, and it also reduces the output of fraudulent money, which could be used to help those people as well.
Early on in my I&E career, somebody once described I&E as the entity from the OIG that holds up a mirror to an agency or a program and says, this is what you look like, okay? But we don't stop there. We hold up that mirror and we say, this is what you look like, but then we also say, this is what you need to look like. An inspection at a high level, I would argue, is looking for compliance. We have a set of standards and we go in and we say, are you doing things the way that you are supposed to do according to procedure, policy, law, best practice, what other people do, common sense. An evaluation is looking at, is this program or agency accomplishing what it is intended to do? Are the outcomes what they are expected to be?
In 2006, the Fire and EMS department had been going through almost continual controversy about whether the EMS side was being very efficient or effective in delivering emergency services. And then the incident with David Rosenbaum, it hit front page.
Mr. Hamlin, anything you want to say?
No, sir. No, sir.
23-year-old maintenance worker Michael Hamlin is now charged with the murder of New York Times journalist David Rosenbaum.
He'd been found about 9:30, lying on the sidewalk in the 3800 block of Gramercy Street Northwest.
I was watching the news coverage, and I said to my wife, I remember this, I said, that is going to be I&E's next project. And it was.
It was all about the allegation that district agencies didn't respond appropriately to a person in distress on the streets of the District of Columbia.
Mayor Williams felt that the best way to handle this controversy, this really big controversy, was to go to independent source to look at it, and that's why he tapped the Inspector General.
We went into Rosenbaum, the team went into Rosenbaum, the office went into Rosenbaum, wanting to figure out what happened that night. Rosenbaum was retired, prominent journalist, walking 9 o'clock at night in a presumed to be safe neighborhood.
This guy was badly beaten. And what appeared to be a robbery. And he died 2 days later. But a lot of things didn't make sense at first blush. And it didn't take a lot of digging to come up with questions like, what did the emergency medical technicians say they found? Why was he taken to Howard University Hospital when Sibley was nearby? Why was he lying on a gurney for hours when he got to the hospital? Oh, they said he was drunk.
The fact that it was an assault was not immediately detected. The severity of his injuries were not immediately detected. And he was dismissed as being a drunk. And that set in motion a series of non-responses and less urgent response than that situation should have been given that day. Any type of response like that is a system. Okay, there's OUC handing off the proper information. What do you have? ETOH, the shorthand for alcohol. Right there is a critical failure. There's the handoff between the firefighter first responder and the ambulance first responder. There's the handoff at the hospital. What do you have? ETOH. All of that information gets handed off from one person to another. The handoffs were so poorly documented, and it turned into a very bad, sad, tragic game of telephone. When we write a report, you can distill it down to 3 things. What we found, more importantly, why you should care, and most importantly, what we want you to do about it.
You know, people got fired, reassigned, regulations were rewritten, new protocols put in place.
But it also led to setting up a task force. The recommendations that came out of the Rosenbaum task force, which were predicated on the work of the Inspector General, were critical to improving EMS for about a decade.
And so every project that we do, it's not just about a government process or a program. You can always tie it back to people.
You've alluded to the idea that sort of the way that OIG does its job has changed over time. How has the way your team works changed?
Yeah. That's a great question. For OIGs, they essentially do one or several things related to auditing, inspecting, and conducting investigations. Traditionally, those things occur separate and apart from each other.
We run as a system now, so there's a lot more communication and collaboration to be sure that we're delivering the best product given whatever walks in the door.
and you can get at whatever it is that you're trying to understand much more efficiently and in a focused way.
It boils down to skills, institutional memory, and experience. Do you want me to talk in the context of Benita Jacks or just?
Sure.
Okay. It was shocking.
We approach all cases with the same, amount of concern, but the Benita Jacks incident touched most of us, all of us rather, and that it was children.
The Benita Jacks case has been talked about quite a lot. And that one, as Washingtonians, I think we all that stuck out.
Everybody was, tuned into that.
As a government, we are investigating this as if the 4 young people found are the 4 children of Benita Jacks.
What happened was Marshall showed up with an eviction order. She didn't want to let him in the house. But they learned through the intervention, there were 4 dead children in the house. They were all her children. She killed them.
There are going to be charges placed against Benita Jacks today for felony murder in the case of the 4 bodies that were found yesterday.
It was gut-wrenching.
One had been dead for a number of months. They were, in a way, under the city's care because they had child and family services over them. Nobody looked in on them.
The murders of 4 young girls at the hands of their mother in Washington sparked outrage across the nation.
And that outrage grew when it was learned DC Social Services had been asked to help the children, but they didn't.
I remember a press conference maybe about 4 or 5 days after the bodies were discovered, and they said these were the 2 or 3 seminal moments that the family came in touch with DC government.
We are going to look at the conduct of employees of the District of Columbia government, and where we are going to very likely recommend and take personnel action against any employees who are responsible for failures in the case.
The mayor's office reached out to the Office of Inspector General and made a request that a special evaluation be done on the services provided to the Jacks family. There was a decision quickly internally that it would be a collaborative effort in the Inspector General's office.
That was a project that we worked on as a cross-functional team here in the OIG. Members of Inspections and Evaluations, Audit Unit, Medicaid Fraud, and Investigations. And we needed to muster all of those skills and experiences in navigating DC government.
You put forward a Swiss Army knife, if you will, one with different components that can get at different things that you're looking for.
People from Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, we relied on them to figure out when certain public benefits were loaded, how they were loaded. In I&E, we were looking at process. We would subpoena cell phone information to see if we could figure out the calls that the family were making. Investigators would go out and interview people who knew the family members to try to figure out the full narrative.
Spoke with officials in the DC Public Schools, teachers and administrators at the Child and Family Services Administration, spoke with supervisors. I also interviewed individuals that worked for some of the community-based organizations.
You begin to see that this was a family that received a lot of supportive touches that was in crisis. She was receiving a housing subsidy, so the rent was being paid for through a program that should have afforded the family monthly visits. And when you see all of those touches, and you see that there weren't just 2 or 3 seminal moments, but 30 or 40 or 50 touches, makes it harder to assign and point the finger at one person or one entity. And that's what the message of our report was.
Did the school system miss him? What about relatives? Well, I went to the door, but she wouldn't let me in. Nobody missed them. 4 children. Nobody missed them. That's the nut and bolts of it. Entrusted to the city's care, in a sense, because the services the city didn't perform.
What struck us when we got to the end of this project was how many things were done well. But how many things were done well in isolation? So there's the housing piece, which is put in place and it was done well and it was a benefit and it was there and they had housing. But the housing piece didn't know that the family had lost the nutrition piece. The housing piece didn't know that the girls had stopped going to school. Program through which they were receiving housing didn't even know that the family was being evicted. You get to the end and you say, nobody saw the big picture of what was happening here. Part of the message that came out was, in order to prevent tragic events from happening again, we have to do something to break down the silos in district government.
So now it's my pleasure to introduce Inspector General Daniel W. Lucas.
In district government, everyone is responsible for at least 2 things: achieving a particular mission and maintaining the public trust. Oversight is a daily responsibility for all district employees. We can do more to maximize the efficiency and effectiveness and delivery of value to district residents.
Winning limited home rule in the mid-70s, we had the opportunity to form a government that reflected our values and the city that we wanted to become.
To do that, I think the city ought to strive to be a model of service delivery. And that gets us right back to the whole purpose of this, which is to talk about the Inspector General and the value that it brings.
We've evolved from being almost completely reactive to being both proactive and reactive. And I think that's critically important because you want to prevent problems rather than always coming in on the tail end to say, this is what happened, oops.
We don't want to push down bad news. That's not the way to do business. And we encourage our folks to find the problems, even if it's bad news. Let's get on top of it and get it fixed.
When you have an Office of Inspector General, they can operate outside of the system. When you have an agency that can respond to any manner of mismanagement, fraud, or corruption in the city, it gives that confidence that the city can run itself.
All right, let's cut there.
Cut.